No one wants to talk about it. In fact, we wish we didn't have to. But child abuse is a tough subject that must be addressed, and protecting children from abuse should be one of our top priorities. I'm Jeff Coleman, and I'll be your host for the next 20 minutes. You have access to resources and protections that can make a difference in a child's life, and we want to help you understand the importance of these protections, as well as your role in preventing and reporting child abuse. So first, let's talk about who is exactly considered an abused or neglected child. We need to know the definition. The short answer is anyone under the age of 18 who has caused harm by a parent, a guardian, or other person having custody or control of that minor. More specifically, there are 4 common types of abuse to be aware of. The first one we call neglect. That's the failure to meet a child's basic needs physically, medically, or emotionally. Second, physical abuse. That's defined as the intentional or reckless use of physical force that results in injury or risk of injury. Third is emotional abuse. That's the practice of behaviors that harm a child's self-worth or emotional well-being. And finally, sexual abuse. That's engaging in sexual acts with a child. Now, abuse in any form is all too common. Here in New Jersey, abuse reports involving 80,000 children a year are filed. 50,000 of those children receive prevention and post-response services. 75% of the victims involve neglect. 18% of the victims are physically abused. Psychological mistreatment accounted for 7% of the cases. Now that's a lot of statistics, but stats like those aren't confined to a single demographic. The figures are the same across socioeconomic classes and religions and ethnic groups and educational levels, but 55% of the perpetrators in those cases were females, while males account for the remaining 45%. What's worse, some 30% of these abused children will later abuse their own children, creating a generational cycle of abuse. One of the most common questions about this topic is what role does the government play in protecting these children? For the state of New Jersey, every level of government has a role. The state takes responsibility for enforcing the law through the New Jersey Family Division Courts in each county seat. Now, they're provided with broad powers, and these courts can take remedial action, including removing children from dangerous situations. The Department of Children and Families, especially the Division of Child Protection and Permanency, combines all state operations intended to safeguard children into a single coordinated program, working closely with the courts, legal advocates, and law enforcement. Next, the Department of Corrections operates adult prisons and youth correctional facilities to deal with perpetrators, while individual counties operate youth detention centers and special purpose schools. Now, at the local level, education professionals have the most contact with children and are often the first to detect issues. Housing authorities in municipalities that operate youth recreational programs may also come into contact with abused children. The role of police agencies is particularly important because they assist in resolving reported situations and are often acting as first identifiers of abuse. In New Jersey, the law gives police broad authority to protect children, including the ability to remove them from their parents or caregivers without a court order if necessary to prevent imminent danger to a child. Now let's talk about signs of abuse, what to look for, and what they might mean. Some obvious indicators can be unexplained fractures, burns, bruises, or welts in any stage of healing on a child, particularly in a pattern or grouping that might reflect the shape of the object used. The timing of these injuries can be significant, especially if they appear after a weekend or vacation. A child's behavior can also indicate potential abuse, like wariness of adult contact, a fear of parents or going home, apprehension when other children cry, or extreme behaviors like aggression or withdrawal. Other indicators might be poor peer relationships, begging or stealing food, or the inability to stay awake in classes. A child might also be unwilling to change clothes or participate in gym, preferring to remain withdrawn, immersed in fantasy or acting in ways too adult or too infantile for their age. As you could probably guess, child abuse can often have long-term effects on victims. A lack of trust and a difficulty with healthy relationships is common, as is a core feeling of worthlessness and low self-esteem. There may be even long-term trouble regulating emotions that can lead to destructive behaviors. Child sexual abuse is a particularly troubling topic to consider. Peer-to-peer is by far the most common, That's where one child or adolescent sexually abuses or inappropriately touches another. Legally, the abuser must be at least 4 years older to trigger the statute. The American Psychological Association reports this type of abuse is driven by power and dominance, the same factors that drive bullying within this age group. In fact, bullying is often a precursor to sexual abuse, especially when there is a lack of supervision. Adult-to-child abuse is even more disconcerting because it is typically thought out and planned in advance, demanding access and privacy and control. These three factors demand a very specific type of relationship and setting, meaning that 90% of juvenile sexual abuse victims know their abuser. Let me say that again, 90% of juvenile sexual abuse victims know their abuser. The scope of the problem is massive. By the age of 18, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys have experienced sexual abuse. From those figures, 88% of those molestations are attributed to individuals with pedophilia. Pedophilia can be defined as the sexual preference for or strong interest in children. Now, it's important not to confuse the attraction of pedophilia with actual child molestation, as many pedophiles never act on their attractions. Now, child sexual abusers are not always easy to spot. Though 7 of every 8 molesters are males, they match the general population in ethnicity, religion, education, and marital status. There's no stereotype, and abusers often go to great lengths to blend in. But only 10% of them abuse children they don't know. 68% look no further than their own families for victims, and it begins early. 40% of abusers begin molesting children before they themselves reach the age of 15, the vast majority of them before the age of 20. These teenagers generally begin their acts of abuse on younger siblings. Despite hearsay, acts of abuse by strangers are very rare, and patterns of abuse are common, with 47% of child abusers admitting they themselves were sexually abused as children. Now, as we've said before, most abuse occurs within the families, but molesters can gain access to children through employment or volunteer work with an organization that works with children. This allows them time to be alone with the potential victims and the ability to build trust and credibility. In fact, child abusers are often known and respected in their communities for dedication to children. When it comes to a victim profile, it's important to remember that though these are characteristics that make some children more at risk, every child is in danger. Some specific characteristics that abusers look for? Well, passive, lonely, or troubled children, especially those who live with step-parents or single parents. The most vulnerable age? Between 7 and 13 years old, and children from low socioeconomic backgrounds or rural areas are more likely to be victimized. Molesters themselves have behavioral patterns that can be identified as grooming their victims. Sexual abuse is rarely violent. The molester's goal is to build a manipulative relationship, often started by showing favoritism to build trust. There might be pet names or gifts to foster exclusivity and build value while starting the practice of keeping secrets. The molester might begin to spend time with the victim outside of the regular program or schedule, contacting parents to become involved in a child's life in some capacity, like babysitting. For this reason, many parents are shocked after abuse comes to light, simply because the abuser seemed too good to be true. Inevitably, the favoritism is not enough to keep the victim silent, and the abuser resorts to threats that play off of a child's guilt over sexual contact. Now, during that grooming process and abuse itself, victims often begin to show telltale signs. Sexual abuse behaviors, strong sexual language that's too adult for their age. Many children feel at fault and begin to suffer guilt and depression, even resorting to self-harm such as cutting, scratches, or other self-inflicted injuries. Research shows that children often delay reporting sexual abuse. They should not be disbelieved just because they waited a long time to seek help. So when it's all said and done, we all want to know what we can do to help an abused or neglected child. As a government official, employee, or volunteer, you're legally required to report suspected child abuse. This requirement includes all government officials, all employees, all volunteers. In fact, unlike other states, New Jersey law specifically provides that, quote, any person having reasonable cause to believe that a child being suspected to abuse shall report this immediately. The good news is that any person who in good faith reports suspected abuse or testifies in a child abuse hearing is immune to any criminal or civil liability that might result. You need to know that you can choose anonymous reporting as well. Look, child abuse is a hard thing to talk about, especially with victims. But the most important thing to remember is to show calm reassurance, unconditional support, avoid interrogation and leading questions. Let the child explain in their own words. Anything else could confuse and fluster a child, making it hard to continue. Understand that denial is a common reaction. Don't display disbelief, shock, or disgust, which can shut down the conversation immediately. Make sure the child knows that they did nothing wrong. This is incredibly important. Reassure them that this is not their fault. Let them know that you take what they say seriously. Look, interviewing children to investigate sexual abuse requires highly technical expertise. Don't investigate an abuse situation. Instead, report it immediately to the Child Abuse Hotline. And finally, keep safety as the priority. If there is the possibility of violence against yourself or the child, get the appropriate professionals or agencies involved as soon as possible. Now, all government entities must have procedures to deal with child abuse. In addition to vetting and training, policies should provide a written protocol for notifying the parents or guardian of a minor in case of an emergency. Whether medical or behavioral, natural disaster, or any other disruption, these can include, first, requirements for medical treatment authorization forms, and a policy forbidding the release of children to anyone other than the parent, the guardian, or authorized adult. A policy that does not allow staff or volunteers to transport children in their own vehicles without written authorization. Police agencies must adopt procedures specific to the transportation of minors. Policies forbidding staff and volunteers from meeting privately with a child. Procedures for monitoring bathroom changing facilities. Guidelines restricting the taking and sharing of images of children on social media or any other platforms without parent or guardian consent. Instituting anti-hazing and bullying policies that also cover cyberbullying. Look, police also have broad authority to protect people 18 and over who are subjected to domestic violence. This is important because children are often victimized in households where domestic violence also occurs against spouses or others. Under the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act, a law enforcement officer must make an arrest when the officer finds probable cause that domestic violence has occurred. This holds true even if the victim refuses to make a complaint. That's important to know because the act is involved in situations where the victim exhibits signs of injury caused by domestic violence, when a warrant is in effect, or when there is probable cause to believe that a weapon has been involved in an act of domestic violence. The term exhibit is liberally interpreted to cover any indication that a victim has suffered bodily harm, such as pain or impairment of physical condition. And domestic violence is not only about physical assault. Abusers often use psychological tactics to gain control over their partners, such as making threats to prevent a victim from leaving or contacting friends or family or police. But even if these conditions are not met, an officer may still make an arrest or sign a criminal complaint if there is probable cause to believe acts of domestic violence have been committed. Now, if there is no visible sign of injury, but the victim states that an injury did occur, the officer must take other factors into consideration in determining probable cause. So to conclude, let me again reiterate, this is not just the police who have a legal duty to protect children. This requirement includes all government officials, all employees, and all volunteers. You can be held liable for a child's abuse or neglect if you fail to implement safeguards and protections for the children under your care. This also means that you're under penalty of law to report suspected child abuse. The Department of Children and Families maintains a hotline to report child abuse. That number is 1-877-NJ-ABUSE, 1-877-652-2873. You can choose anonymous reporting or ask that your name remain confidential. But remember that any person who in good faith reports suspected abuse or testified in a child abuse hearing is immune to any criminal or civil liability that may result. I'm Jeff Coleman. Thanks for joining this important conversation about protecting our children.